This is April the 3rd, 1991, and Joy has asked me to tell the story of when she was 6 weeks old, and I had to leave my mother's home very, very precipitously. What happened was, well, I'll just go back, Joy, to the night before you were born.
Okay.
The night before Joy was born, my mother was getting very impatient because she didn't want the problem of having to transport me to the hospital, although I had made arrangements with the local taxi driver to come at any hour of the day or night. And she said to me, "Have you made your will?" which I thought was a very nice thing to say. Well, anyway, I had Joy, and I stayed with my mother for 6 weeks, and it was extremely uncomfortable because she did not like my husband, and she treated him very badly. And at the time, she had a bunch of people staying in the house who treated me like I was the under-scullery maid. And then on the Sunday before Bank Holiday in August, which is the first Monday in August, and Joy was 6 weeks old, Fritz was down there with me, and it sort of came to a head because my mother was extremely nasty to Fritz, and I decided then and there that I couldn't really stay there no longer because he was not welcome. And so he and I went for a walk down to the little park, and we sat and talked about it, and I was wondering what on earth I could do. And so I went back to a public telephone, and I called my aunt in London, Auntie Lou, and I explained the situation to her, and I said, "I cannot stay here any longer because Fritz is not welcome, and I'm not going to stay here without my husband." So she said, "Give me time to think about it, and I will send you a telegram in the morning." And so sure enough, the next morning a telegram arrived which said, "Come, let me know what train you will be on, we will take care of you." And so Fritz took the baby carriage, the baby bath, and a lot of the baby stuff that we had, and went up on the Sunday. And then on Bank Holiday Monday, which is like the 4th of July, all the trains, of course, were jam-packed, but there was a Cockney portress, you know, a lady porter, and she pushed everybody out of the way and said, "I've got a mother with a young baby." And so she got me a corner seat in the carriage, and I went, and my aunt was waiting for me at the other end of Waterloo Station. And so we went to her apartment, and she said, "I have a small apartment for you next door," which I went over, and to cut a long story short, she threw the people out that she had a very nice second floor apartment with a balcony, and she told the lady, "Well, I'm very sorry, but you're going to have to leave. I'll get you another apartment. I need this for my niece." And so that's where Joy and I stayed until I came to the United States.
Now, when you came to the United States, was that when you went on the Vein Dam and it was such a rough crossing?
Oh, no, we went on the Queen Mary. And they as soon as I got word from the United States Air Force, I went to an old British Army camp called Tidworth on Salisbury Plain in the middle of nowhere. And it was, you know, derelict old barracks. And there were just a few Americans there, and a lot of German prisoners of war. And these were the people that were taking care of us, and we really had a very, very rough time. But we were there about 8 days, and then we got on the Queen Mary, and it was very sad because as soon as the wives were being shipped, the United States Air Force and Army sent telegrams to the husbands to come and meet their wives. And every day in the big lounge there was a long list of names of those that had replied. And of course Fritz had replied almost immediately. But hundreds of the husbands never let them know. And so those women arrived in New York Harbor with no one to meet them. It was a really tragic situation, and this friend of mine was telling me just how badly they were treated going across country. So that was how I got to the United States. Now what do you want to know, Joy?
So when you got to the United States, then you stayed with Grandma and Grandpa Zengel for a while, didn't you?
That's right. Well, actually, almost as soon as I left Southampton, you had a convulsion right at the dinner table. And so I rushed you upstairs to the hospital, and you were 10 months old, and they took your temperature, and I said, what is it? And the girl didn't want to tell me. I said, what is it? And she said, it's 105.8. I said, get the doctor. She said, he's having his dinner. I said, I don't care what he's doing. Get the doctor. So he came, and on the trip before, on the Queen Mary, they had lost 2 babies with pneumonia. And so they were being very, very cautious. And this is when, well, I guess penicillin had first come out, because they gave you penicillin. And you spent the entire trip in the hospital with all these nurses and doctors to take care of you, which was really very nice, and I was very happy. So when we got to New York, the Red Cross sent a grey lady to get you, and I walked down the gangplank to Daddy. The first thing your father said was, where's the baby? And so that was my introduction to him. Yes, then I stayed with Grandpa and Grandma until Daddy went back to MIT to school, and then we went up and lived in Boston. Okay?
You moved to Boston when Daddy went to MIT?
Yes,
that's
right.
Why you moved to Boston?
That's right. Mm-hmm.
When was the Bean Dam episode?
Oh, well, as soon as Daddy had finished at MIT, he got a job teaching at Manhattan College, which was way, way to the north of New York City, and he had almost...
in New York?
Yeah. It was almost an hour and a half to 2 hour trip. And we were signed up for Shanks Village, but we were way, way, way down on the waiting list because Manhattan College had such a small quota. Shanks Village was an old army camp that was converted into a place called Camp Shanks for students. It was like student housing. And so we were way down, and so Daddy said, well, why don't you know, my father had died, and Daddy said, why don't you go back to England for a trip to see your family while we can, and I'll get a room up near the college. And so that's what we did. But it was interesting because I met Father Clancy from whatever the Resurrection Catholic Church, and he said, oh no, how are you? And I said, well, I'm fine. And he said, where are you living now? And I said, well, I'm still living with Mrs. Zengel. He said, you can't do that. And I said, well, I'm sorry, but... So he said, I said, well, we have our name on Shanks Village, but it won't be for a while. He went right back, and as soon as I got home, I got a telephone call, and he said, you will be in there within 3 months. Oh, and that's when Daddy said, why don't you go back to England? So I went back, and then it was a pity because I got there, and about 3 weeks later, Daddy got a call saying that we could have an apartment. So I tried to get back earlier, but I couldn't. So
the Bean Dam was on the way over or the way back?
Both ways. And on our way over, which was February,
we had a terrible storm.
We had a terrible storm.
Well, talk about that, eh?
Well, I was deathly sick just outside New York Harbor, and so were you. But I sort of got over it. And then one night we had this dreadful storm. They came and they put these great big, they looked just like manhole covers, over the portholes. And during the night, we heard the waves going right over. This was a big ship, right over the deck, and then you'd hear this swish, you know. And then they dropped us off at Southampton and went on to Amsterdam, and they were in dry dock until I came home in July.
Wasn't that supposed to have been one of the worst storms?
That was one of the worst storms, yes, But it was exciting. Coming back, though, it was smooth as glass. It was wonderful. So, what else do you want to know?
What did you do in England when you were there for the 3 weeks? Did you visited your
3
mother?
months. I stayed with my mother for 1 week. The rest of the time I stayed with Auntie Lou. And, we just visited, and, I just lived. Olive came down to my mother's and visited.
What was she doing at that time?
She was up in Stourbridge at the Corbett Hospital, She was
matron at one time, wasn't
well, no, she was the sister tutor. She did get a job as a matron at another hospital, but she told my aunt that the responsibility was much too much for her. Olive is a great one, but she didn't want to take the responsibility of the hospital. So she went back, then she went back to Battersea Polytechnic, and she got her teaching credential to teach pre-nursing students in the high...
She did that at Corbett. I mean, she wound up teaching at Corbett, didn't she?
Oh, yeah, she was a sister tutor, but she got out of that. When socialized medicine came in, she got out of that and went back into regular teaching in the public schools, teaching girls of 14 to 16 that were interested in a nursing career.
That's what she did down in Bournemouth.
Yes, okay. What else do you want to know?
Why don't you begin at the beginning now and tell me the earliest thing that you remember?
Well, the very earliest thing I remember must have been Armistice Day of World War I, because I was about 3, and I remember parading up and down in this yard, carrying a little flag, and knowing that it was something very important.
You're not being sure what?
Well, I mean, I was only 3, I didn't know what it was, and we were staying there for some reason. I don't know why we were there, but that was my earliest recollection.
And where was that?
That was in Plymouth.
Mm-hmm.
And we lived at that time in an apartment where I was born. And there was an old lady that lived upstairs, and her name was Mrs. Oakley. She had two sons, and she had been a nanny or a governess to a very aristocratic people. And she still wore Victorian clothes. She wore one of those bonnets, you know, the black bonnets with jet on, and a little, you know, the little black shawl with the jet on it.
Mm-hmm.
And she wore divided drawers, you know, and elastic side boots. But she was very kind, and she was very interesting, little old lady. And then we moved from there to...
what was your father doing at that time? What was he working?
Oh, he was working at the workhouse. And that was right opposite Baker Street Station. And every Christmas Day, Olive and my sister and I used to alternate, because my dad was in charge of making sure that all the inmates had a wonderful Christmas dinner. And so Olive would go one year, and I would go another year. And then when we went, my mother would always give me a shilling to give to, what was the old lady's name? I forget, but one of her patients. And Dad would take us all the way around to make sure that all the patients got a nice Christmas dinner.
Now, what was your father's title?
My dad was, he was kind of a steward. And he was in charge of supplies for the workhouse. And actually, the workhouse wasn't a bad place, except that it did separate old men from their wives. I mean, you know, other than that, it really wasn't too bad. I mean, the conditions were fairly good. I mean, they had a nice room and they had food. A downside better than some of these homeless people today, you know.
Well, who went into the workhouse? Were they poor people or elderly people, or who were they?
You mean that went into the workhouse?
Uh-huh.
Well, I mean, in those days, they didn't have anything like Social Security. And it wasn't until, I can't remember, it was during World War, or was it World War, that they brought in what they call the old age pension. But see, some of these old people were just like abandoned. Mm-hmm. And the only place they could go was the workhouse. And that's
so they were all elderly?
Oh, they were all old people. Oh, yes. Oh, yes. Well, sometime now, Charlie Chaplin, for instance, was born in Marylebone Workhouse. But his... did you ever see Far From the Madding Crowd?
Yes, I did.
Well, do you remember when the young woman went into the workhouse and had her baby? So they used to take in, well, derelict, young, abandoned mothers and old folks. And what else you want to know?
Let's see. You mentioned your mother had patients, too. Did she work at the workhouse?
Oh, my mother was a nurse, and she trained as a mental nurse, and she was this very famous mental hospital called Coney Hatch. And then she met my father at St. Pancras Hospital, where they were both, and then Dad went to Marylebone, and my mother went to Marylebone. And
so
she was, and that's when they got married.
When they got married, the tea set that I have, that was a gift from the people at St. Pancras?
I don't know. I didn't know
I said
that.
it was a wedding gift. That
Oh,
gift.
oh, well, I didn't know that. I didn't know that, but, oh, you wanted to know about Psyche, didn't you?
Yeah, tell me about Psyche.
Well, Psyche must be very old, because my mother was only a young nurse when she had something, and I can't remember exactly what it was, but she had something that this other nurse wanted more than anything, and this other nurse said, I'll give you anything you want of mine, and so my mother took Psyche, and that must have been, what, at least 70 years ago, something like that.
Mm-hmm.
So it's quite old, and it's marble, and Olive called it Psyche, but I don't know who she actually represents. What else do you want to know?
Okay, let's see. I sort of interrupted you. You were talking about your earliest memories, and that was one of them of going at Christmas time
Yeah.
with the shilling.
Mm-hmm.
What else do you remember?
Well, we used to go, every year we used to go to the Isle of Wight for our summer holidays, and this is one reason why I really don't care about swimming, because it was nearly always cold, and I remember being cold all the time. But it really was a wonderful place that we went, because they had these rocks covered with seaweed going way out, and of course you could spend hours on the beach. And so we stayed with my Auntie Alice, who had feather beds, which was a real treat.
Now, Auntie Alice's husband was the light keeper?
Yeah, he was the lighthouse keeper out at the Needles. And my father's other sister, Auntie Kate, she was a midwife. And she lived in Richmond, and we used to love to go down there. And she always used to send out for cakes. And then her children's wives always played the piano, so we always had a great time down there.
That's near London, isn't it?
Richmond, it's a good way out. I remember Olive and I rode our bikes down there one time, which was quite a long way. When I was 11, I sat for a scholarship. See, in those days they didn't give free high school, and so I sat for a scholarship. And it was interesting because my sister was at this very new coeducational high school called the Wilson County School. Most high schools were boys or girls. And so when I won the scholarship, I came in, I think, second in the county. And so instead of sending me to my sister's school, they sent me to this very posh, expensive girls' school, Brunsbury and Kilburn High School. And believe me, I was scared out of my wits. I had never been there, and I was so frightened that I had nightmares all the first week I was there. But I was all right. It was a beautiful school. And so I was there for 5 years. And then I got a scholarship when I was 16 to go to Chelsea Polytechnic for 2 years.
That's up in London?
That's in London, yes. And by then we had moved to County Hall from Neasden.
And what was your father doing at County Hall?
My father, they called him the housekeeper, but he was in charge of all the night staff.
And your mother worked?
My mother worked with him, yes. She was in charge of all the cleaning of the 8 floors. And then when I finished at Chelsea Polytechnic, I had to do my apprenticeship. Well, first of all, apprenticeships were very difficult to get, so I started to train as a nurse. And I think I would have enjoyed it very much. Unfortunately, my parents' address was County Hall, which was the headquarters of all the London County hospitals. And the sister tutors, thinking they were doing me a great favour, would bring me at the head of the line on payday and say to me, here, take a couple of hours off, I want this to go to the matron-in-chief, you might as well see your parents. Well, you know how well that's set. And so anyway, I did train for 3 months, and then I got an apprenticeship.
Now, did you have to go and look for an apprenticeship? Or did you
No, they were always advertised in the pharmaceutical journal, so I got an apprenticeship, and then I went, and I couldn't get a scholarship to the London University, so that's the only time my parents paid for me to go. And I did it, instead of taking 2 years, I only took 1 year, and I nearly died from studying. Because we went to school from 9 in the morning till 5, and from 9 to 1 on Saturday, every day, for a whole year. Mm-hmm. And so, but there were 80 of us took the examination, and only 20 passed. So that was how I became a pharmacist.
Now, when did you work down? You worked in a very, very So dangerous.
Logan, that was when I was an apprentice. Oh, that was
Now, you
fascinating.
weren't doing that at the same time you were going to school. You did that before you went to school?
It's after I left Chelsea Polytechnic. I had to get indentured just as an apprentice. I had to be signed in as an apprentice, on-the-job training, it really was. And it was it was just, I'd say, half a mile from the very notorious Pentonville prison, where the people were hanged, you know. And it was fascinating. It was right on the corner, the store was, and right across, in an upstairs little flat, was this guy, and I remember his name was called Fortinbras. And he was wanted for murder. And I knew it. But well, if I'd opened my mouth, I'd have been... But I was a young lady from the chemist.
Well, there was some other didn't you tell me there was an abortionist lady?
Oh, yeah, Mrs. Kitchener. Yeah, Mrs. Kitchener. And she had a dresser in her kitchen that swung around, and she had this room in the back where she performed abortions. And the police knew she was not, but they couldn't catch her. They didn't know how she did it. And she was well known all through there. And right just down the road a little bit was a pub, which was a fence. And the lady next door would come and say, "Hey, would you like a nice fur stole? I've got a nice fur stole you could have." But I was the young lady from the chemist.
Now, did you go out and deliver in this neighborhood?
Oh, 2 or 3 times, just out of poor little Daisy Atkins. She was living on 10 shillings a week, her old age pension. And she couldn't walk very much, so I told my boss, I said, "Oh, I'll run over with a medicine for her." And God, I went in her room. All the baseboard was eaten away by rats. And she said to me, "I don't really mind them. They don't bother me that much." She said, "But I don't like it when they get up on the bed." So she'd moved her bed into the middle of the room. And that's what she lived on, 10 shillings a week. And then another time, and I remember this poor girl's name was Button. And I said, "Oh, I'll take it over." And I went over in this store, and I said, "I've got some medicine for Nellie Button," or whatever her name was. She said, "Over there." And it was a ladder, not a staircase, it was a ladder. And I went up, and there she was in the bed, just a cot. And I tell you, I could tell some stories that make your hair stand on. And then I told you about Wally, who was my cousin's husband. He was a narcotics guy in Limehouse. When he heard where I was doing my apprenticeship, he said to my mother, "Have you any idea the kind of area that your daughter works in?" She said, "Oh, she's perfectly all right." There was a street there called Warren Street, where the policemen would only walk in pairs because they put one down a drain. But we used to go down there to get our bottles.
Oh, dear. Now, did you actually make up pills?
Oh, yes. Oh, that's where...
What sort of things did you make up pills for? Anything? Like nowadays, they get all the pills and they just dispense them. Did you make all your pills, or did some come?
Well, not so much there. I didn't learn to make pills, and I made a lot of ointments and salves there, and eye drops and stuff like that. I never made pills until I went to work at Harrington's in the London Wall, and then we had we used to have our customers that needed these particular pills made up, and suppositories and cachets, and but when I was an apprentice, it was mostly medicines, lotions, ointments, eye drops, eye ointments, stuff like that. So that's what I learned mostly there. And of course you learn business and window dressing and stuff like that. And then after that I went back to school and became a pharmacist, and then I got a job with Cunningham's down in Wimbledon, because strangely enough he owned the store, but he was not a qualified chemist, so he always had to have somebody with him. But then when George was called up, I took over Harrington's, and that's when we got some very exotic...
Now, that was up in London.
Yeah.
You went from Wimbledon.
Well, Wimbledon's in London.
Right.
Yeah. See, I lived at Wimbledon. But then we'd have some very exotic things, because we had a lot of foreign customers, and they would have bring in a prescription for cachets or pills, and then I'd have to make the pills. And yeah. So, did you go in the little pharmacy in the Black Country Museum? There was a chemist shop there. He had a pill machine right on the counter. No, well, anyway, that was exciting because we made all our own cosmetics, and that
Now,
was.
do people come to you and say, "Oh, I've got an acre"?
Oh yeah. Oh no.
See, in this country, pharmacists don't do any. They just fill prescriptions. They don't.
Oh no.
Whereas this summer when we were over there, we went to the pharmacist and said about Justin and Brandon, they've got a terrible runny nose and so forth, and they said, "Well, it sounds like an allergy to me. Why don't you do this?"
Yeah.
So you did a lot.
Oh yeah, we did a lot, and also I did a tremendous amount of first aid. People didn't go to the doctor; they go to the chemist.
So like what sorts of things?
Oh, I'd bind up people's wounds.
Oh really?
And I would say at least once a week I would be taking something out of somebody's eye. And the way I used to do it, we had drops with cocaine in, and we drop a drop in there and roll the upper eyelid back on a little rod and put drops in. Yeah, because now you'd be sued, wouldn't you? Mm-hmm. And we had all kinds of doses. People would come in for stomach, a dose for diarrhea or a dose for tonic or something like that. Oh, I had a row of them along there. That's what I say, it was very interesting. Very interesting. And then people would always drop off their prescriptions, and I had a row like with clothespins all the way along, and then we take them in order, and then on their way home they pick them up. Mm-hmm. And then in the afternoon, our busiest time was between 11:30 and 2. And so Prue, my assistant, would go to lunch at 11 and I'd go at 2. And then from 2 to 4:30 is when I did all the dispensing. Mm-hmm. And so it was very interesting.
Now, you were at that job when the war broke out, right?
Yes.
You were at Harrington.
Yes, I was.
And then when the war broke out, everybody was frozen in their jobs,
yes.
weren't
Yeah. Mm-hmm. I couldn't have moved. I was frozen in my job, and it was interesting because I got a notice from the War Department giving me a choice. At that time, I was even smaller than you are. I weighed about 110 pounds. And they offered me, I could be heavy rescue worker, work on a crane, gas decontamination, and there was one other thing. And I wrote them back a letter, and I said, well, if you could fit this in with what I was doing, I would be happy to do it. I never heard from them again. But I did do fire watching. My friend and I took us.
Now, what was fire watching?
Well, in case incendiary bombs came down.
But you'd sit up somewhere and...
No, we'd just we'd walk the streets for about 2 hours, about once a week. And then, of course, you knew I was hit by a flying bomb.
That was when your apartment was destroyed?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Did you like talking about that?
Oh, yeah. Well, it was interesting because this friend of a friend of mine was so frightened of the rays, and of course the flying bombs were coming over now all the time. Mm-hmm. And my apartment was on the ground floor, and it was fairly safe. It had a nice long wall that I could stand. Well, she asked if she could come over, so she came up. She stood against my safe wall, and I stood against the door. Well, this thing landed on the parish hall of the church next door and demolished it. And it's the most interesting thing I remember was looking at my bedroom, and this is what we've talked about, this time slowed down. And I watched my whole bedroom very slowly blow apart. And the bathroom door slowly turned around and hit me and broke all my ribs. And it was all slow. Anyway, they whipped me out. I wasn't unconscious or anything, and I looked over my, I forget, somebody was holding me up. And I looked over, and coming through my French window was a GI. And he said, what can we do for you, lady? And so, I guess it was my friend's husband, said, get this lady to the hospital. So he took me to Wimbledon Hospital in a Jeep. And so all night long the damn things kept coming over,
You were in the hospital?
I was in the hospital. But right in the next bed was this 16-year-old girl. Oh, God, her back was full of shards of glass. So when the nurse came around, I said, look, if you could just strap me up, I could get out of here and somebody could have my bed. So they strapped me up, and they turned me loose, and I didn't know where to go.
Now, your apartment had been destroyed.
Oh, yes. I went down, and my apartment was all boarded up. And so I'm wandering around where on earth. There was nobody around. And then this lady and her son came by and said, come over with us. Well, this sounds like fiction, but it's the honest to God's truth. Her husband was what you call a second-story man, and he had fallen and been killed.
Oh, dear.
And everybody in the apartment house sort of ostracized her. But she was the only one around. So we spent the night under her dining room table. And so the next day I went out trying to find someone. And I ended up in a shelter. And they took me in and they said, "Oh, you poor dear." They put me in a long thing that looked like a shroud. And I tell you, they cosseted me. And she said, "Now here," she gave me a great wad of clothing coupons. And I had, for some reason, I had my fur coat over the shroud. And I went next door to where they were giving out these clothing coupons. And what did I do then? Of course, I'd met Daddy and we were going to get married, but I was staying I couldn't leave London. But, of course, then, that excused me.
Oh, when she was injured or
Oh, yeah. Oh, I called Daddy, and the lady, in the police station, Mrs. Dye, they said, come down and you can stay with us.
Now, Daddy was down there?
Yeah, Daddy was down there, And so I got this car and I went down there.
This was to Thetford?
Yeah, to Thetford, and I arranged to have my furniture sent down there. And so I lived, first of all, let's see, how did it... I had spent a week down at Thetford, staying in the Lamb Hotel, and Daddy and I went around, and, we really got to know one another, and the Dyes and everybody like that. And then when this all happened, I stayed with the Dyes. And Mrs. Dye said to me, now I'm frozen. No, I wasn't. Yeah, I'm still frozen, but I was on sick leave. So she said to me, can you teach school? And I said, well, the only thing I've ever taught is Sunday school. And so they corralled me and got me to teaching. So I taught for a week until we got married. We were supposed to get married on the 11th of September, which was a Monday. But the permission from the army had not come through, and it hadn't come through on Tuesday. And on Wednesday, Mr. Dye, Inspector Dye, went hunting, and that was he was going to give me away. So my parents couldn't come, they were frozen. He was going to give me away, but he went hunting, and that was very important, because we got rabbits and pheasants and all those illegal things.
You mean he wasn't supposed to?
That's right, he was the inspector. That's right, you're right, yes. And then Thursday, the minister, the priest that was going to marry us, was being installed or inaugurated into the church. So we got married on Friday, and I'd been teaching school for a week. So I had all my little fourth grade boys all around while I got married. And so I continued to teach school until I was very pregnant, and then I went, which I never should have done, but I thought, I would go and stay with my mother, which I should not have done. I should probably have stayed in Thetford.
That's a wonderful thing. Tell me, you've told lots of stories in the past about teaching your 9-year-old boys. Tell me some of the things about, tell me about some of them, and tell me about when you did Christmas for them.
Oh, okay. Well, I had never really lived in the country. I was a city girl. They had outside John's, the poor little boys had to go outside. We had gas mantles. Well, you pulled a thing down and you lighted it, and it was like a little thing like this, and you light it, and that was the kind of thing you saw in Edwardian. So anyway, when it got dark enough for those, I called the principal. I said, I'm sorry, I don't know, how do you light these things? Well, I had 28 little boys, and we didn't have enough textbooks for them. We didn't have enough paper or pencils or crayons. Daddy brought me home a whole slew of scrap paper. And so I could have taught them anything, because nobody checked on me, but we had a ball. I was reading them the travels of Odysseus, on the Argo, and the Wind in the Willows. And some of the children were from Dr. Bernardo's home in the East End of London.
Now, what was that?
Well, Dr. Bernardo in the late 19th century went around the docks and saw all these little boys sleeping in barrels and under bridges and things, and he set up these homes, and they were still going when I was teaching school, but they were more or less for unwanted children. And I had 2 or 3 of those in my class, and it was a fascinating experience, because I was learning as much as they were. I read the lesson and then
The night before.
And anyway, then Christmas came, and since Daddy didn't smoke, he traded in all his cigarette coupons or vouchers for candy from the other GIs, and we managed to get 28 candy bars. And I went to a little bookstore, all the little bookstores, and I got these little, for a nickel, these little tiny storybooks. And then he got gum, and we managed to get 2 sticks of gum for each of them, and a threepenny bit, which is a nickel. And I wrapped them all up. And so when it was the last day of school, I put a long word on the board. I put incomprehensible on the board. Now I said, I want you to take a piece of paper and write down as many words as you can from this word. So they didn't know what was going on. And then, of course, when I'd finished doing the register and everything else, and then I started giving these out. Some of those children, Christmas was nothing to them. I asked them, when I went back to school after the Christmas vacation, I asked them what they had done for Christmas. And most of them had done nothing. And this was, manna from heaven. I tell you, I was almost in tears because I couldn't believe that this little treat was so important to them. And so that was Christmas. And then I went to stay with my mother, and of course, that was...
Didn't you tell me now, didn't they have a strange accent? It seems to me that you were working...
Oh! Yeah, they would say everything was beautiful. And when we were singing the carol, something wrapped in swaddling clothes, of human view displayed, and I said, now, we're going to take time and we're going to learn how to say beautiful. And I'd say, be beautiful. And I'd say, be beautiful. Oh, they had some very strange words. In fact, you might ask Daddy where he's got a whole book of Norfolk words. Like if they had something on their hand that was a spot, that's a poosh. So, anything else? Oh, well, I can tell you about our life in the
police
station. Well, we had one very large room. One very large room right over the jail. And Mr. Dye and Inspector Dye lived this side, and his sergeant lived that side. And the police station was in the middle, and we had the big room over the top. And so some of the things that happened were really funny. Like one night they picked up a GI who was completely drunk, and they threw him in the cell, which was completely unheated. This is the winter in Thetford. And he took off all his clothes, and the sergeant said all night long he paced backwards and forwards. He was sober in the morning. And then there were a couple of GIs that had been picked up for fighting, and Joe Dye calmed them down and said, now, and then we heard them through the window, let's finish it off right out. And then Christmas morning was absolutely hilarious. It was Christmas Eve, and this wing commander from the RAF base drove up, must have been about 1 o'clock in the morning, and hammered on the door. And by now they had closed the police station in the evenings because they'd called up everybody but Joe and his sergeant. And of course nobody answered, and finally Joe put his head out the window and said, what's the problem? And he said, in very, very posh accent, he said, I want you to come down here, And so there was this argument going on, and in the meantime the sergeant opened his window, and the wing commander turned around and he said, you with a dirty face. And by now Joe and the sergeant both went down, and Joe had to restrain himself. Well, what had happened was that the wing commander's wife had come down the day before. She couldn't get in touch with her husband, and there was nowhere for her to go because there was no room at the hotel at all. So they put her in the workhouse, which was better than nothing. And so when he came over trying to find his wife, he couldn't find her. So anyway, everybody was calmed down, and the next day Joe went over to the RAF base and came back feeling no pain at all. Oh, we had more fun in that police station. So what else do you want to know?
Tell me some of the stuff that you remember like life in general when you were a kid. Daddy did some of this when he was telling me, for example, that when he lived in New York City when he was a kid, he remembered riding all over New York for a nickel. Tell me some of the things that you remember that are very different from now. Like,
oh, yeah. Well, we lived in this a housing development, and we had our bread delivered every day. And the man that brought it, his name was James Love, and he had a thing that looked just like a sedan chair with the handles. And he came round every day with fresh bread, and he walked miles. And of course we had milk delivered, and we had a little old man came around on Saturday mornings. He was a peddler, and he had a little suitcase, and he had it with pins and just like the peddler doll, you know.
oh, really?
And well, we used to go on the buses and the trams to all over the place. And of course, then when I lived at County Hall, the Old Vic was just around the corner, and for a quarter on Saturday afternoon, I saw all of Shakespeare and the opera and everything else, just walked around the corner. And it was very interesting.
Tell me about, I'm interested in kitchen type stuff, like what kind of stove did your mother have? What did she cook with? And you had electricity when you were little. Okay.
Oh, yeah. My mother had a regular gas stove, yeah. But now washing day was Monday, and that's when the whole house was in an uproar, because over in the corner of the kitchen, or scullery rather, she had a scullery and a kitchen.
Now what's the scullery?
The scullery would be really like a like a laundry room where you did your washing dishes and stuff like that. And the coal bin was over in the corner. But over in the...
What would you do with the coal? I mean, you
burn coal.
Put that in the stove?
Oh, yeah. Not to cook with, but to
heat, and that you'd put heat up the water.
But she had a copper, which was
a copper boiler?
Like copper boiler. I mean, it was built in, and you had to, the early ones, you had to light a fire underneath. You'd get up early Monday morning and light that fire.
Why copper?
I don't know why it was called a copper.
No, but I wonder, why was it made of copper?
It wasn't made of copper. No, it was just a big steel tub. The early one was set into bricks. But later on you could buy an electric one, which was great. And she'd wash all the stoves done by hand, and then all the white clothes would go in the copper and be boiled and hung out on the line. And, you know, Monday was always cold meat and odds and sods for dinner, because that was an all-day affair, the washing. And she was a good cook, but she was a lot like Barbara. She didn't like to cook too much.
Now, your parents both worked most of the time.
Oh, my mother never worked.
Well, but she worked when she was a nurse.
Oh, yes.
Before you were born?
Yeah, oh, yes. She worked, well, she went and helped my Auntie Lou for a while, and then she took in a boarder for many years, and that was Bessie, who took me to the Catholic Church every Sunday. So I was more or less a Catholic until I was about 14. Now, speaking of Catholics, my dad was really a great guy, because he worked at the workhouse, and they had a little Protestant chapel and a little Catholic chapel, and the Catholic sisters, Sister Scholastica and Sister Benedict, would come over, and their chapel was very, very shabby, and the Protestant one was fine. And so my father went to the guardians who took care of the workhouse and asked, would they please refurbish the Catholic chapel. So the sisters were very fond of my father, and every year they had a big sale of work or a bazaar, and we always used to go, and I always used to sell raffle tickets for them. And I remember I won a doll, and it was dressed from the skin out, and I remember it had a pair of corsets on. That's all I remember about it. Yeah. So but he was really a great person, my dad. He was kind. I wish, you know, you can always look back and say, I wished I'd known him better. But, you know.
Now, he traveled a fair amount. Tell me about when he went to Malta. He did
well,
that while...
Well, I don't remember. That was when I was a baby. And Olive told me this, that my mother could have gone all over the place with him, but she would not go. And he had, in fact, she showed me, he had the offer of several very, very fine jobs after the war, but she wouldn't move. So, you know. I didn't know that.
When did he go to South Africa? That was before...
Oh, that was when he was only 17. See, when he came out of the orphanage, There was money divided. And now Terry said that was from a fund.
For the orphans.
Yeah.
And Princess Elizabeth.
Princess Alice, and I thought it was from his family.
Yeah.
But Terry said they were really quite poor.
Mm-hmm.
I don't understand that. Her family was certainly not poor.
I know.
See? But anyway, he was, when he came out of the orphanage, I suppose he was about 16 and a half, and he went to live with Kate.
That was
His,
in Isle of Wight?
no, in Richmond.
In Richmond, okay.
And so he was apprenticed to a pharmacist, and then the pharmacist made a mistake and lost his license, and so Dad lost his job, and then he went and worked with a plumber, and he didn't like that, so he signed up, and I don't think he was any more than 17. And he joined the Royal Army Medical Corps and went to South Africa. And I don't know when he went to India, but he was in India too.
Oh, I didn't know he'd ever been to
Yeah,
India.
he was in India too, but I don't remember when he went to India.
Was he was in the Army Medical Corps
Yeah.
at the same time? Uh-huh.
Mm-hmm.
I never knew he'd been to India.
And I don't remember, I don't know when he went to India, whether it was when he first went into the RAMC or whether it was, no, because he came right back from South Africa to England as soon as the South African War was over. But he was in India because he brought all that Indian brass.
Oh, that's right.
Yeah, I don't know what happened to that. But, so he came back and he got a job, I guess, at St. Pancras, and then he went from St. Pancras to St. Marylebone, and then from St. Marylebone to County Hall.
Now, when did he go to Malta?
Oh, that was in World War II. He was at St. Marylebone, the workhouse.
Uh-huh.
And as soon as World War I broke out, since he'd been in the RAMC, he volunteered immediately. And he became, I guess, a sergeant major. And of course everybody said, you know, you're crazy. But he got up to be a captain, and he never saw any action. And he was with Supply. He went all over England, and he would send my mother a piece of the Gosh china from each town, because he was not allowed to tell her where he was.
Right.
And then toward the end of the war, he went to Malta.
That's
my-
World War I.
Yeah, and see, my mother could have gone too.
Yeah.
And then he went to Germany with the Army of Occupation. And she could have gone then, and she wouldn't go. But, he wanted so much to go back to Germany. And,
No, now he was in Germany too?
oh yes, he was with the Army of Occupation after World War I.
Oh.
And he always wanted to go back to Germany because he loved it so much. And in 1939, just before the Battle of Britain, before war broke out, he finally persuaded my mother that they would go. And of course they couldn't go, so he never went. So that was it. A lot of opportunities down the pan.
Tell me the story about when your mother got the phone call, and that's when the silver and the other family things were handed over to her.
Oh, yeah, we lived at County Hall then, and my mother got this telephone call, and she said her name was Terry Burns.
She was an older lady that called.
Oh, yes, she was quite old, and she was dying in Paddington Hospital. And apparently the priest called. It wasn't Terry. I called my mother, and my mother went over to see her, and she was dying, and she told my mother that she had some things belonging to the children, to the Burnses, that really should be passed on to the children. And she gave my mother the spoons and those pieces of china, the old...
The ones that Barbara has, right?
Yeah,
The 7
yeah.
pound saucer. And they supposedly belonged to who?
My father's father and his wife. Now, where did you get those spoons?
Olive gave them to me.
But where did they come from?
There was a card inside the box from your mother and father giving them to her. So they had them.
Yeah, but whose spoons were they?
We've never been able to find out, because the initials on them are J.M. and they were made in 1829, and they don't fit anybody. Those initials don't fit anyone, and the time is wrong. So I have no idea.
It wouldn't be Selina's mother?
No, Selena's mother's first name wasn't a J name. It was I don't remember what Selena's mother's name. It was Catherine. It was Catherine. The best I can come up with, I think those spoons belonged to Jane Carr, and that they perhaps were a wedding gift or something like that to her, because I've read that when gifts were given, the wedding gifts were given, it wasn't the bride's married initials that were put on them, but her maiden initials. So if she was
Then she would.
Jane Murphy or something, there would have been JM on her, because she was a widow. It would have been JM on those spoons. That's the best I can. Is there anything I can do to make the dates fit?
So you think it might have been Mrs. Kerr's then?
Right, right.
Isn't it? You know,
So see, then they would have come to Hugh, and it would have been passed on to. And wound up there.
It was interesting though, because if I hadn't seen the family Bible.
Talk about the family Bible. Tell what you remember about the family Bible.
Well, it was an enormous 2-volume thing. It was huge.
Huge?
Yeah, like that, as big as that. Very.
Describe how big that is.
Well, that would be about, I'd say about 18 by 12, big, and about 5 inches thick. 2 volumes.
Was it leather bound?
Leather-bound Scottish Bible.
It was in English, was it?
Oh yes, but it was quite old, and all the family was in there. And it was. I remember seeing. I think it was John. Wasn't it John? What was Hugh's father's name? John?
I think it was John.
John. I think it was John. He married the widow, and she had several children. See?
From her previous
marriage, yes. And then she had, as far as I remember, she only had the one boy, and that was Hugh. And then, of course, then there's all Hugh's children in there.
That's the 5.
5 children, yeah. And then, I don't know how my father got the Bible, but yours, then Olive and I are in there. And the only reason I think I remember it so clearly is because I remember either Daddy or I put your name in there. So if I hadn't seen that, I would have wondered if his name was really Burns.
And then my name is the last entry.
Yours is the last entry in that Bible. And see, somebody is lying, Joy, because my mother said she gave it to Phyllis, who gave it to Joyce. And I asked Olive about it, and she said the same thing. Now, somebody is lying.
Well, because Terry finally did track down Joyce, and Joyce said she'd never seen it.
Noreen tracked it down.
Yeah.
So I don't know what happened to it.
And of course, with your mother dead and everything else, who knows.
I'm more inclined to think she perhaps pawned it.
Well, she may not have remembered what she did with it, frankly, Brenda.
No, she was as sharp as a tack right to the very, because her letters, she wrote to me just before she died, and her letter.
But what I'm saying is that she didn't value it.
Oh, no,
no. She would specifically remember, well, I gave it to this person or that person. If she disposed of a bunch of stuff at the same time, she may not remember who she gave.
Well, I think all the Maltese figures and the Indian brass and all the glass that Olive gave, I think that was all sold. See that, but anyway, it's no use crying over spilt milk. I was fortunate to get my father's medals, but I still clearly remember in that box room a large portrait of Selena and her husband. And I also remember, and Barbara says she's never seen it, a picture of a man and a woman. The woman is sitting in a chair and she's got pink on her bonnet or something. But, I was very fortunate to get anything. Olive gave me the rug, she gave me the Maltese bracelet, the Egyptian bracelet, she gave me the Maltese cross, and she gave me the Maltese bracelet. That's all I got, and I was fortunate to get that. So, I'm getting dry. Now, you asked me to tell you about Auntie Lou. Well, Auntie Lou, I guess nowadays you'd call her an entrepreneur. Anyway, when she married Uncle Fred, who was 23 years older than her, and she discovered almost immediately that she was never going to be able to rely on him to earn the living. And so she was only a young woman, and she went over to a cousin of Uncle Fred's and asked him to let her have about half a dozen pairs of boots, children's boots and shoes, which she put in a suitcase, and she went to a big low-cost housing development, and went around, and with her own book and everything, she let them have them on, 2 or 3 shillings a week. And she made enough money to buy a very tiny little boot and shoe store, and also repairs. And that did so well that she bought another big shoe store this time. And that did so well, and she really didn't want to part with it, but along came Boots the chemist, you know, and it was such an ideal location that they gave her a fabulous amount of money for it, and they retired for 2 years.
Is that when they went to South Africa?
No, it was before that, and I used to go over there and have a wonderful time with her. But she was the one really that introduced me to music, because she used to, for some reason, used to leave me alone in the apartment with the gramophone and Chopin's records. Everybody else would go out, so that's how I was interested in music. Anyway, after 2 years of retirement, so to speak, Uncle Fred used to make a lot of money on the racetrack. I mean, he used to follow the horses. I mean, it was a study, and so they had quite a few killings. Like she had a set of sables, and she had diamonds and everything else.
Now, didn't he have you told me he had not exactly a system, but he had a certain amount of money set aside?
Yes, he always kept a bag, and that was the money that he would only gamble on. And then,
so what happened if he gambled it all away?
Well, then he would save some more money, but in other words, he wouldn't go beyond that amount of money. And then they went to South Africa, and that wasn't a great success, because Auntie Lou got so terribly homesick. But they were there several years, and they came back just before the war.
Now, what did they go there for? Was it for business or pleasure? Or?
Oh, he was a butcher, and he opened a butcher shop out there, but I'm not sure, right in the Cape anyway. But Uncle Fred had been back and forth to South Africa many, many times, because he was an asthmatic, and he did very well out there. Now, anyway, they came back just before the war broke out. Or was it? Yeah, just before the war broke out. And so then they had a butcher shop over in Hampstead for a while, and that didn't pay too well. And so, then Auntie Lou. Oh, before she went to South Africa, she'd never run a restaurant before, but she decided after she made all this money from the boot shop that she would open a restaurant in the city, right in the city, and it was called Wishbone or something like that. And she was so successful that was when they made enough money to retire for 2 years. I had forgotten that.
What kind of restaurant was it?
It was a regular restaurant.
But I mean, like, so was it like a dinner restaurant?
Lunches only.
Didn't you work in the restaurant?
I worked in there one Christmas. Yeah, two of her girls were out sick, and so I went over there, and I had a ball. I thoroughly enjoyed it. It was real hectic, but it was a lot of fun. And I took care of all the glasses of water and the desserts. That was my job. And let's see, when she came back from England, she bought the lease on one of those tall Georgian houses. This is where you and I lived. One of these big Georgian in London, in Maida Vale, on Elgin Avenue. And she'd never done this before, but she divided up the whole house into floors for apartments. And she went, everybody said, "You're mad," with the bombs. It was bombing. But she went to hotel auctions, and she bought up a lot of big furniture, because there were big rooms, and she furnished the whole thing, and she rented them right away. And, of course, I got one of the choice ones in the front there. And so she was there, I think, 7 or 8 years, and then she finally did retire. And they had another apartment, and that's where I lived when I went back from the United States and stayed. And then after Fred died, she went and took care of one of his cousins, and that's the one that left her all the property, and in Kew, where we went?
She didn't buy that, she inherited
No,
that.
she inherited that from, I can't remember that. But she was very good to this lady, took care of it, all the rest of it. So then you wanted to know about me going on disaster?
I know she's like
Well, I was with the Red Cross in Japan. I was actually with Red Cross for 27 years. But when I was in Washington, I was a volunteer consultant. And I was responsible for Ohio, Virginia, West Virginia, and Kentucky. That was my region. And I worked with a paid staff member who was responsible for that. And so they wanted to send me on disaster in Kentucky. And I went in southeast Kentucky, which is the mining area. And I stayed in a town called Harlan. And I was in they put us in a motel there. And my job was to go out with a station wagon over a road that was half broken. When I set out, I never knew whether I was going to get back. And I set up a sort of a station or a registration place in a place called Everett's. And so I did that for almost 3 weeks. And but when I first got there, it was absolutely chaotic because there'd been 3 feet of water in all the houses and it had drained away. And the first thing I did was to set up a shelter. I'd never done anything like that before. But there was a nurse and I, and between us we set up this shelter for all these people. And then they said, well, where are you going to feed them? So I commandeered some church workers. And I wrote chits for food, you know. I figured if it was wrong, it was wrong. Mm-hmm. And so the different churches came and got the people and fed them. Mm-hmm. And then they put me out into to Everett's to set up. And one of the things I remember, I went out on a field trip with a sheriff, and beside me on the seat was a gun, and we went right out into the boonies to deliver food. So that was interesting. And then the other time I went on disaster was when they had the West Coast floods in 1965. I went from Riverside then, and that was right after Christmas. Was it? It was right at Christmas.
It was right at Christmas, yeah.
Yeah, because I remember that